This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so we'll kick off. So thank you very much for your time. It's great to reconnect with you. Just to remind everybody, this is the fourth conference, fourth webinar since we set these up 4 or 5 weeks ago. It feels astonishing how quickly time has passed. Just to clarify, I say this at the beginning of every one of these, we're recording this and it will be available online if anyone feels a desperate desire to listen to it a second time. And we will also share the slides, and I will do that much more promptly this time. Last week, I actually delayed circulating until after the Easter weekend, and I know that that caused a little bit of a hiatus for some people. So these slides will be circulated within minutes of the end of this webinar. Because we had Easter this week, it's been a bit quieter on the WhatsApp group, and I think also we're finding that we're getting nicely settled into the process. And in fact, as we'll come up here, you're going to see that there's quite a bit of talk now around what happens as we come out of the current epidemic, rather than how we're dealing with it as we go into it. But let's start with the first slide is always the overview of what the group looks like. We've now got 197 organizations, utilities and municipalities from around the world, from 39 different countries. And if you look at that map, we seem to have everywhere covered apart from Japan and Russia. And I said to Charlotte, you know, that feels like the challenge for this week is to try and get Japan and Russia onto this group. Not that world domination's my a particular thing that I obsess about. So the group's growing. The growth is slowing now, which is just as well, because we've got 220 people on the WhatsApp group, and there is a limit of 256. So we're getting to maxing out. So over the next 15 minutes, these are the things I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about 4 of the questions that were raised on the WhatsApp group chat and share some of the outcomes from those. I'll give you an update on the technology outreach program that we've done. And I'll also, we've got 2 recommended reads this week, and I'll give you the headlines from those. That's the 3 main things which are going to be covered here. Just before we get to that though, we've included a couple of slides on the global lockdown status. So there's a slide here that summarizes what's happening in Europe and the Middle East. And the next slide, which will pop up on your screen in a second, shows what's happening in other parts of the world. Now, the reason we've included this has been because, as I said at the beginning, we're in a stage where a number of countries have now been in lockdown for 5 weeks. It's Italy and Spain in particular who were the first in Europe outside of China to go into lockdown. And they're also, not surprisingly, the first ones to come out of lockdown. And I think there's quite a lot of learning that we ought to monitor here. Just as we went into the lockdown, there was lots of learning that needed to be shared around what were people doing that they were learning from that they wish they'd done. If you might remember on the very first one of these webinars, I think it was the first one, maybe it was the second one, we had the Italians. We actually did an interview with a couple of the Italians to talk about, well, what did they learn and what would they have done differently with the benefit of hindsight. And I think that might also apply as we come out of lockdown. There'll be certain things that we ease off doing that maybe we need to control. So my point here is that first of all, this is a marathon, not a sprint, and we don't yet know whether we're at mile 2 of that marathon or mile 20. It feels like, based on the last 48 hours, it feels like we might be at mile 20. We might be able to see the end of it. It's not another 6-8 months. It's possibly another 3 or 4 weeks is what it feels like right now, but who knows? And that we should watch what's going on in these different regions, and in particular, watch what's happening in Italy and Spain. So what we're going to do in Isle is we're going to keep monitoring that and see how people come out of the lockdown. And if there are particular things that you and your organization are doing that you think would be good to share, that would be great, because we'll capture it here. So now we come, oh, and sorry, on that, overnight, we also had some, purely by chance, overnight, Poland, some people in Poland actually sent us a fairly detailed response of what they were doing in Poland. It came purely by chance. I hadn't asked for it, but as I produced these slides yesterday, it felt like this was a good one to slot in. I guess an interesting takeaway here is this bit that I've highlighted in red at the bottom, which is in one of their tourist areas where they've not allowed people to go to, water consumption has dropped by about 30%. And I'll come back to that because that links to one of the questions that comes up in a minute. So if we now come to the questions that came up, the first one, as is always the way, links to around PPE and in particular around face masks. And you no doubt saw this YouTube video that's copied at the bottom of this slide of someone showing how you can make a face mask using a pair of socks. That, not surprisingly, led to a whole series of debates about whether cloth masks were good, and more debate around the size of the coronavirus is only 1 micron, and even the best masks seem to only be at sort of 50 to 60 microns. And actually, if you make a cloth mask, it's actually at 200 microns. So arguably is not very effective. I think the takeaway from this is that if you've got good PPE, use it. If you haven't got good PPE, you can reuse it. You can do a bit of washing of it, which we've talked about previously. But actually, if you're not comfortable doing that, then actually social distancing is probably just as effective. And yes, it is possible to make sort of handmade PPE, but it's probably not advised. If one compelling reason for that is that actually people who are wearing a mask might become overconfident in what they're doing and actually might then expose themselves because they trust in a piece of PPE that actually isn't verified. I'm paraphrasing a bit. That's the debate that came through on the WhatsApp group. The second question that came up this week on the WhatsApp group was around recommendations of how to deal with potential contamination in households that have storage tanks. In particular, it's around chlorine dosing. There's 2 slides on this, and they both have pretty much the same message, which is that universally, wherever you are and around the world, and you can see here, it's in the Philippines, it's in Italy, it's in South Africa. On this slide, it's the same feedback again from the United Arab Emirates. It's the message that conventional chlorine dosing with a residual of 2 ppm, 0.2 ppm in the water is clearly effective at keeping the virus down in water supply. So I think there's some sort of reassurance there. There doesn't seem to be any sign of that being a problem area. Our third question, I got the numbering wrong here because I moved the questions around. So it says it's question 2, but it's actually question 3, linked to change in demand patterns. Now this slide is actually a repeat from last week because I got a number of requests to revisit this slide and explain this graph because people didn't believe me when I described it. So this graph comes from Canal de Isabel in Spain, and they monitor water usage on minute by minute basis, and that little drop that you see that's circled, that drop that's occurring at 8 p.m. aligns with the fact that water usage has dropped by about 10% because people are out in the streets clapping and celebrating and singing to the healthcare professionals. We do something similar in the UK, and it's quite a nice moment for community engagement. What then led on to this week was something that Jerry Galvin, who I believe is on this call, sort of took this one step further. Now it's only one man, one family, one data point, but it's a useful bit to visit, I think, in that what he did was he kindly measured his water usage this week now that he's got all his family at home. So the argument here is that domestic...
I claim credit for this. It was my colleague Adrian Cronin that did this, not myself.
You're absolutely right. Sorry, you're right, Jerry. Thank you for clarifying that. Yes, I knew I got the right organisation at least. It was Adrian Cronin who did this, and we'll have to correct that on this slide deck before I send it out again. And he read his domestic water meter. Sorry, the point being that with everyone staying at home, that's got to result in increased water usage. There's more toilet flushing, there's more cooking, there's more washing up. Clothes washing should stay the same. You know, there'll be some things that stay the same, but what's the increase? And so he looked at his own data and he saw that the increase went up by about 23%. Now, the reason I think this is interesting is because as I mentioned last week, when I was at Thames Water, about 20% of our water usage went to industrial customers. And roughly, we've seen a drop by about 10% of water usage in industrial areas. Water usage appears to have dropped by about 10% in some cities, linked to the fact that their industrial usage has probably halved. Now, what's interesting here is that if domestic usage is going up by, let's say, 20%, that more than accounts for the halving of the 20% that would be associated with industry. Now, I think this becomes important because obviously it affects the revenues which come into water utilities, especially where they are metered. If it's on a rateable value, then it's obviously less, doesn't have an impact. But where you've got metered supply, this sort of thing might protect your revenues, as we see domestic revenues ought to increase when industrial ones drop. The last question that came up was one around regulators and utility interactions. And this was a specific question that came from SA Water in Southern Australia. And actually this debate was taken offline. So this then led to a series of email interactions, and we've at the request of the people who are involved, we've anonymized the responses here. But basically the question was in particular to the UK market, where we have an economic regulator who controls who regulates the business plans here. Was a question around, well, what's the regulator doing to support utilities during this difficult time? And the answer was basically they're focused mostly on industrial customers, non-household customers, and they've acknowledged that they will do something, but not until after the event, not until after the crisis has passed, which isn't hugely helpful. There is a letter that was sent by the chief executive of the regulator, and that's copied here on that bottom link. A letter sent from the chief executive of Ofwat to all the chief executives of all the water companies, which basically, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to the style in which it's written, but basically said, the world is watching you, be careful how you behave, make sure you serve your communities properly. It's slightly big brothery for my particular taste, but there you go. There are some examples of excellent practice, and one water company in the UK in particular, Northumbrian Water, I know is actually paying its small suppliers immediately, and it's not holding them to long terms of payment. And of course, as we all know, for small businesses in particular, cash is king, and trying to survive through periods like this is particularly difficult. And that feels like a nice way of supporting the community without necessarily giving away your product for free, which is what I think some people think we should be doing at this stage. Utilities should just issue water and wastewater services for free, and that doesn't feel like the right answer either. So those were the 4 key things that came up this week. If I now move on to talking about an update on the technology outreach. For those of you who weren't involved, 2 weeks ago, we decided it was determined that it would be useful to get a sense of how much technology is out there that might be able to help address the COVID situation. And we and ISLE took it upon ourselves to do a sort of initial assessment. We reached out to 2,500 companies and got back some responses, which we did an initial qualification on, splitting them down into these 4 groups: detection and testing, removal and deactivation, remote monitoring, and contingency options. That then led to a whole series of questions around, well, are these technologies verified? And that then means that, actually a separate piece of work was proposed to do a more detailed horizon scan, technology horizon scan. The proposal has been that would be funded by multiple utilities, each putting a small amount of money in. And I circulated the proposal earlier this week, and we've started to get back a few responses. We haven't got enough to kick this project off just yet. So if you're interested, it would be great to have your sort of email from you just saying, yeah, we're in, and then we can hopefully get to the minimum number and kick this piece of work off. There is a slide here that's just coming up on your screens, which outlines the project overview and its purpose and approach and outputs. And you can read that at your leisure. But basically, it's a detailed horizon scan that will enable you to find, verify, and present the available solutions technology solutions that might help us, not just through COVID-19, I have to say, but through any future epidemic type crises like this that might come up. There are some unanswered questions. There's one in particular around technology here and around the use of remote technology and what people are using that for. And we'll continue to sort of highlight those. What I would like to do is just come to the last thing on this presentation, which is around the recommended reads. So I said at the beginning, there are two. The first is a wash, it's entitled Washing COVID-19, and it's produced by the World Bank. And there they identified 3 priority areas. Now, the first 2 aren't really relevant to us as utilities. The first 2 are related to healthcare and hygiene, encouraging people to wash their hands properly. But the third priority area, and there were only 3 identified, the third one is specific to utilities. And you can see here, it basically summarizes, this is about getting point of use access to water and wastewater services, building emergency plans that will ensure the continuity of that supply, and then finally providing financial support to prop up the organizations that are going to do it. It's a really interesting read, and I encourage you, if you've got any interest in the sort of developing world aspects here, this is a good document to refer to. Document which actually many of people on this webinar, because it's focused for the North American market, will be aware of, is the American Waterworks Association, and they've done this survey on COVID-19, taking feedback from just over 600 organizations. Now, there's lots of good news here, which I think is worth just capturing. So the good news is that everyone, 97%, everyone is managing to keep their essential services going. And I think that's something that we should remind ourselves of. Yeah, we are a vital industry serving our communities. And actually in this time of unprecedented difficulty, we are keeping the system is continuing to operate. Pretty much everyone has also had to shift their staff patterns. I say everyone, it's 95%, but people have had to change their staffing options to accommodate this new world we live in. And again, I think that's something to celebrate. We're often accused of not being an innovative or adaptable sector. And I think what we've shown through the last 6 weeks, is that actually this is a sector that's very robust and is able to change when needed to. What's also interesting is that most of the organizations, over 50%, are expecting absentees over the coming months. Most are expecting PPE shortages, although not everyone's experiencing them just yet. And most, 64%, as you can see on this next slide, are expecting this to have a negative impact on their revenue and cash flow challenges. However, and this comes back to my point earlier on, only 10% are currently seeing that impact. So everyone's bracing themselves for the problem, but actually it's not quite appeared just yet. So again, it's a useful read. I encourage you to read it. It's got more good news in it than bad news. It was my takeaway. And it's quite an uplifting document. As always, we have these other links to documents you might want to refer to. There's an interesting website here from Oxford University, which actually gives you pandemic simulations for 150 countries around the world, and that's now available to the public. So that's a sort of fascinating place to go to if you're a stats monkey. And then there's various other interesting reads. So I'll just finish with saying, next steps. So there's 2 things to draw your attention to. One is there is a Google Docs survey which has actually already been circulated on the WhatsApp group, which will help prioritize what are the areas that people really want to are really struggling with. I'll include the link to that on when I circulate the slides as well. And then also, if I could just remind you, if you're interested in the technology outreach scans, if I could have your responses by the 24th of April, so by essentially this time next week, we'll be able to either commence that work or move on and do something different. The next webinars will be same time next week, and I'd love you to join us then. I will now pause just in case. Oh, I see there's lots of questions here. Adrian Cronin's come in here confirming that it was him who did it, and he's told the kids that he's reading the meter, so they're conscious of usage. Oh, that's marvelous. Thank you for sharing that, Adrian. Good to see. I can see Alexander, what data do we have available for payment default rates across the globe? In Brazil, we're seeing somewhere between 20 to 40%. There has actually been a little bit of conversation around that. What we'll do, Alexander, is we will raise that question on the WhatsApp group, and we'll see if we can gather some data around defaults for you to share. I'll just pause now. If anyone wants to say anything or share anything, please feel free to speak. In that case, can I wish you all the best, keep safe, and hopefully see you next week. Thank you.
You too. Thanks, Piers.
Thank you very much. It was fantastic. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.